Habari Gani? Njema Habari Gani. I'd like to start with a story. Well, first, the title of my talk is From the Coffle to the Classroom, Education as Political Disenfranchisement. So if you would, go with me across the Atlantic back to Africa. And if you've been there, then imagine. If not, I'll try to paint a picture as much as I can to the central region of Ghana, about 2.5 hours outside of the capital of Accra, in a small township named Asinmanso. And in this particular township is a river. And the river is aptly called the Slave River. And this particular city, even though it's been identified as a large gateway for enslaved Africans to be dispersed throughout the U.S. and the Caribbean, it really didn't get a lot of attention until the year of return. And it is certainly the largest port, slave port. And so when you get to this city, it's an eeriness there. It's a heaviness that blankets the city. And when you drive into the main road, you really don't see a lot of people because the people are really skittish. And they are skittish because once the people on the coastal regions had been decimated, of course, the slavers wanted to move inland. And this particular city sits right at the entrance to the interior. It is also this particular river. It connects, it's a basin, it connects with the Atlantic. So this is the place where you had enslaved Africans moving from the inland. And when they were marched from the inland, if you will, they were marched in what was called coffles. Brother mentioned earlier, and they were chained together, and sometimes these walks would be for months, and so people were debilitated when they arrived at this point. Some of them had never even seen water. You know, you're landlocked, so you have no idea about this large body of water, even if it's just a river. So they were exhausted. But what was interesting about the coffles and when they moved inland, there was always a teacher, someone identified as a teacher on these coffle walks. And this person would be responsible. They did a lot of psychological work that Sister Lisa talked about. They would tell the enslaved that you're going to a better place. They would also teach the rudiments of language. These people were educators. And they would accompany folk. And when they got down to this city and this river, they would take, of course, their last bath. Well, they would actually have 2 baths. One was to refresh, if you could be refreshed after you were filled with terror. And then you would, of course, move in to be bathed again to make yourself presentable. And the teacher was responsible for acclimating and doing all the psychological and social work for these folk to really accept their new identity and status and roles. It was interesting, they would say, you're going to a better place. You're going to make sure. These were some of the things, and they would actually set them down. I tell you that because even on this brutal march, education was present, not as a tool for liberation, but to break the spirit and to prepare African peoples for a life of subjugation. The Coffle March was the beginning of a long legacy of education as a tool of control, and it continued with the breaking in and seasoning. I've been looking at breaking in and seasoning of enslaved African people for quite some time, and I am making the claim that the breaking in and seasoning, because if you think about the U.S., we did not have public education. There was no such thing as public education in the U.S. during the period of slaveocracy, and there certainly was not one. Public education, as we know it, didn't start until after the Civil War. But black folk, as James Anderson has told us, actually started before, during the Reconstruction era. So you didn't have education as we know it, but I would argue that we did. Because the breaking in and seasoning of African peoples laid the ideological or ontologic framework for us to build education. Now, if you talk to education historians, they will tell you that we use the Prussian model. Well, same difference, because the Prussian model, that was a warring people. That was Germany. It was a warring people. So if you think about how education was created and thought about, it was not difficult to look at that warring model when we already had a structure in the U.S. And that particular structure was the breaking in and seasoning of African people. How did that happen? Well, you were taught language. You were also taught what you would do. You were taught to take pride in your subjugation. Breaking in and seasoning is a way to make sure that you had this army of reserved poor that Lisa talked about earlier. So education, if you will, is the foundation of political disenfranchisement from how I am constructing it. So if you think about, much like the enslavement and breaking in and seasoning of Africa, education in the United States has been used to control, manipulate, and to subjugate. So if you're wondering, I call for complete abolition. Complete abolition. My case here today is simple. The colonial project of education has perpetuated anti-Black oppression for centuries, and it has been the root of the terror that we have experienced. It has been the root of the disenfranchisement we have experienced, because as Horace Mann Bond says, that education is a reflection of the society from which it's birthed, nothing more, nothing less. And I would add that education is not just a reflection of its society, it is a tool used to reinforce power structures within that society. So my talk frames education and schooling as a cultural and socioeconomic institution that is deeply political. Some people would think that teaching both sides is not political. There is no neutrality in education at all. The very system itself, why it was created. Education was created in the U.S., first presented by George Washington, to make sure that you had a president. And then your boy, Mr. Tricky, he came along and also wanted to make sure that you had education, to make sure that you had also leaders for the country. That's what education was for. But then Horace Mann, who is considered to be the father of public education, said, well, we need an education that we can ensure that the top 3% will be able to have their wealth. You will become the leaders. How y'all think he got the rich to fund education? What promises could you make? So we fell back on what we already knew, how we could teach, and that was to season. So education in the United States has not only excluded Black people from opportunities, it has served as the primary site where Black inferiority was constructed and propagated. The first university in the United States was Harvard. Everybody loved Harvard. Harvard's claim to fame was race-based research, scientific research. So when we say that race doesn't matter, it always matters, always. Because that is how we got our comeuppance as a nation. We were willing to say things that other countries would not say. And Harvard led the way with institutionalizing this knowledge. Through the curriculum, through policies of educational institutions, and through everyday interactions within school, racist ideologies were not only reflected, but created, legitimized, taught as objective truth. The legacy of this can be seen today in state-sanctioned murders of Black men, women, and children. Anti-Black perceptions and ways of knowing have been organized into the curriculum as legitimate knowledge. Whether through the erasure of Black achievement, the depiction of Blackness as savage and inferior, or the normalization, and this is where we are now, the normalization of whiteness as default. Whiteness as universal. Whiteness can fix anything is the perception that we hold here. So through these normalization of these ideas, we may have structures that change. We may have institutions that change, but these ideas reign supreme. Ideology goes nowhere. It stays and resurfaces every now and again. Carter G. Woodson called this miseducation. How does this miseducation impact our political disenfranchisement? The polity of education is such that we do not learn about how this country runs and our responsibilities within it. So the education and schooling, certainly within Black communities, have been hailed as a great equalizer. But for Black people, education is also a site of deep sorrow. During Brown versus Board of Education, we had more than 8,000 teachers. When we had deseg laws, Brown 1 and Brown 2, we had more than 8,000 Black teachers dismissed, and Illinois carried quite a few of them. These teachers were important because these teachers represented a fugitive mindset. This fugitive mindset you could see with these teachers were the ones that students from the 60s and 70s had been educated by. These teachers were the one who made sure that Black students were able to at least traverse some of the hatred and institutionalized whiteness that they would experience. These students were political. These students understood their rights as citizens, and they made a way for themselves. When those 8,000 teachers were laid off and dismissed, what would happen? Then we would have teachers, even myself, miseducated, and miseducate the young people. So education, so if Black people are continually dehumanized within the educational system, then they are systematically excluded not only from political power, but from humanity itself. Education is a central site for us to learn about the way that this country functions. and to continue to have folk internalize or be educated through curriculum that centers whiteness, it leads to the disenfranchisement and the over-internalization of whiteness as an identity. We see that now in education where we talk about being first generation. I'm telling you right now, you better look at that. You better look at that identity. Any identity constructed by the institution is dangerous. And it has become dangerous because now it has a shape and an expectation. Now there are some responsibilities attached to it. So through education, we have experience or the lack of. There's no such thing as lack of education. Please, if I say nothing else to you, there is no time that folk are not being educated. None. There is formalized and informal education, but there is never a time when education is not present. It is always there. We are constantly being inundated through the media, through religion, and formalized schooling has been a central site of political disenfranchisement. So we have to ask the question, what has the educational system done in terms of our economic exclusion due to unequal educational opportunities? What has been the psychological impact of Eurocentric curriculum? And what of the ongoing legacy of the school-to-prison pipeline? And how has that impacted the political agency, our own political agency? So just to go back, education is not just a reflection of the society. It is a tool used to reinforce power structures within the society. And reparations are not just about repairing the economic damage done by slavery and segregation. It must also address the damage education has done to Black people by stripping away our identities, our histories, and our future. Just as the quietness of the Assam Maso carries the weight of the past, we must reckon with it. So too does our education system carry the weight of the damage it has done. To truly seek justice, we must begin by repairing what was broken, abolishing what was never meant to work, because schools are working just like they are supposed to. And even though I know that we as Black people hold an affinity to education, we must be critical of it. We must not swallow the red pill or the blue pill. One of them pills we can't be swallowing. To truly seek justice, we must repair, including our schools, what our schools have done to our minds and to our spirits. And we also have to hold these systems accountable. What I worry about is that if we are to think of education that is truly about alleviating our disenfranchisement, what will we create on the other side of what we have? Will we recreate the same systems that we have here? What will we do? Our miseducation renders us, to a certain degree, victimized by the very system that we hold up. So as we think about these issues in terms of education and the way that it has been used and these ideas have been used to disenfranchise our political engagement, because for me, that is where it has to start. But it was not meant to be, and it is working. And I think all of our tasks, specifically with reparations, is to help us think about what kinds of systems, like our ancestors did. Our ancestors didn't know what was on the other side of the slaveocracy. They just knew they had to do some work, and so they did. We cannot hold and behold and hold on to an institution that has showed us time and time again that it is aligned with whiteness. All right, y'all, I'm done.